Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. Hopefully you saw our prior episode, and if not, you can watch it on YouTube or listen to it on KBOO Radio. All our programs are accessible through the Public Health and Social Justice website, most simply reached through phsj.org. We've been discussing with Dr. Thomas LaVeist, the Dean at Tulane University's School of Tropical Medicine and Public Health, the issue of slavery, and we've come up so far to about the early 1900s, and we want to bring us forward to some of the post-slavery consequences for African Americans in the United States. The plan is then to talk about the civil rights movement briefly, some of the inequities that African Americans face today, reparations, and then Dr. LaVeist's vision for the future. Welcome back, Dean LaVeist. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you. So why don't we start in, say, World War II? African Americans fought, in fact, fought rather bravely, the Tuskegee Airmen, and bring us forward from there to the civil rights movement.
Let me just take 10 seconds to also point out that African Americans also fought in the Civil War. And this is really interesting because I think that is not well known to many educated people in the United States. In fact, I didn't know until I was actually in graduate school working on a PhD is when I learned that African Americans fought in the Civil War. In fact, they fought on both sides, both the Confederate and the Union Army, and there were 25 African Americans who won the Medal of Honor. So
yeah, I think I didn't learn until I saw it was the movie Glory.
That was how I learned
exactly,
it.
Yeah.
Glory, I learned that, and I said, oh, incredible. And I went out and started reading about this.
Yeah, and
25 Medal of Honor winners.
Yeah, amazing. And I should add, my interest in this area began when I was reading a book called Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace by Alan Kraut, who's a historian at American University in D.C., where he talks about the history of U.S. immigration from various countries and how, be it the African Americans, the Irish, the Italians, the Chinese to build the railroads, were all marginalized, pictured as disease-ridden burdens on the economy, when in fact they are the ones that built the infrastructure of the United States, and especially the African Americans. But a term, and I was a physician in training at that point, a term that was introduced to me was that of drapetomania, and you probably know what this means, and I'll let you explain it better than I can.
No, you probably can explain it better.
Well, drapetomania it's a crazy diagnosis that physicians would use, and it meant the tendency to run away.
Yeah, someone who was trying to run away from being enslaved had some sort of mental health problem.
Right.
It's a diagnosable condition.
Yeah, and we see this mirrored to some degree in Soviet psychiatry back in the 1960s, 1970s, and then the forced medication of dissidents. So World War II, Tuskegee Airmen fought bravely. What happened in the post-war period that brought us to the civil rights movement?
So I think one of the most important things that happens is, as the soldiers come back from World War II, the GI Bill is passed. Right now, the GI Bill is to help the soldiers to reintegrate back into American society. One of the benefits of the GI Bill is educational benefits for higher education, but also housing benefits. The African American soldiers, however, are not able to utilize their benefits fully because they can't attend universities that don't admit African American students, right? So they're limited to the options that they can go to, which are the historically black colleges, and also they can't use their housing benefits because of redlining. So the federal government has a policy, redlining, where neighborhoods are color-coded into one of 4 colors based largely upon the racial makeup of the neighborhoods. And as a result, you can't get mortgage insurance in communities that are redlined, and African-American communities are redlined, and these are the only neighborhoods where black GIs can use their benefits. So if you are going to get a house, if you're lucky enough to get the house in that redlined neighborhood and use those GI benefits, the house will not appreciate, and therefore the potential wealth building that comes from home ownership doesn't accrue to African Americans, while white GIs are able to purchase homes in communities that are able to appreciate, and therefore they build wealth. And as a result, the wealth gap between black and white Americans begins to widen even more.
And what fascinates me, and again, I must confess, I always feel guilty about talking about these issues as a white person of privilege and trying to imagine what it's like, which I can't. I can't imagine the historical experience. I can't imagine the contemporary experience. But I think the least I can do is if I write about, say, the criminal justice system or violence against women, I feel, I guess I apologize for doing this in the sense that I can't experience, but it's the least I can do to try to bring it to people's attention. But what strikes me as rather sad about this is it's all based on the color of someone's skin. And that is such an artificial construct, and that there are so many ways in which people differ at the genetic and even at the phenotypic level that are much more important than that. And that it must be incredibly sad, too, for white supremacists today to be filled with so much hate. And I don't know what it must be like to live with that kind of fear and hatred and lack of empathy.
But look, what you're saying is precisely why you should not feel guilty. So what we're talking about now, this entire conversation is about knowledge, information. Mm-hmm. Information can be learned by anyone who decides to learn the information, right? Mm-hmm. So I have, as an African American, I have no more right to learn that knowledge than you do. Mm-hmm. And I have no more claim to that history than you do. That history of slavery is owned by both black and white Americans. White Americans were the perpetrators in most cases, although there were black slave owners as well. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that we don't all own that history. Whatever aspect of it we own. And it's something that all Americans have right to. So I think you have as much right to talk about these issues as anybody else.
Well, I appreciate that. That makes me feel a little bit better. And I'll confess, I didn't know a lot about this. A defining moment for me in childhood was we got our first VCR when Roots came out. Mm-hmm. And it was actually the first television show that as a family we all sat down, watched together, and discussed. And I'll never forget it. I was kind of sick to my stomach even. I was in something like eighth grade at that point. And that was not what I learned in American history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, much of what we've been talking about in this conversation is not what we teach in American history in American classrooms. You have to go out and seek this history yourself. And I think that is, if you to sort of jump ahead and kind of preview what I'm going to say about reparations, I think that is one of the most important aspects of reparations is that we need to teach the actual history to all Americans, because it's something that we all own. We all inherit that history, and it's our right to know it, and that's our responsibility to know it.
Yeah, I agree. So what did African Americans gain in the Civil Rights Movement?
Oh, well, I think it's an interesting question. I think what happens with the Civil Rights Movement, and I look at the Civil Rights Movement as really beginning in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, although, of course, the 10 years before with the 9 years before with Brown versus the Board of Education is an important milestone, as well as the Montgomery bus boycott and all of the activities that led up to this 64. But 64 is key because this is when the federal government, for the first time, up until 64, the federal government's policies and positions have all been designed to subjugate African Americans. So we passed the GI Bill, but we don't allow GIs to fully use it. We have homesteading, which we didn't get a chance to talk about. But African Americans can't benefit from homesteading, which would have been a perfect way of having reparations, quite frankly.
Right. Well, please explain what that is then.
What homesteading was?
Yeah.
Oh, this is a period, begins in the 1800s. It goes all the way up to the 1970s, actually, is when homesteading ends, where when land in the western part of the country that were not really occupied, the federal government was basically all but giving away land practically for free for anyone who was willing to go and settle on that land. But African Americans couldn't benefit because the initial homesteading laws made it required that you be a citizen. And of course, African Americans were not citizens yet. And then once citizenship, so even though they weren't citizens, Buffalo soldiers would literally out in the West protecting white homesteaders from, from people who might do harm to them, while those Buffalo soldiers themselves, black soldiers, were not able to benefit from homesteading. There was a Southern Homesteading Act that was passed for the South with the purpose of this being a homesteading program for African Americans. But of course, when Reconstruction ended, the Southern Homesteading Act was repealed, and very few African Americans had an opportunity to benefit from that. So there was another attempt. There was also the Morrill Act, which created land-grant colleges. So land-grant colleges are created in 1862. There's many venerable universities, Michigan State University, Florida State University, several other large large universities were created. Federal government gave land to the states to create universities, but then African Americans were not allowed to go to those universities. And the federal government, of course, instead of using its tremendous leverage to say, well, if we're going to give you that land, you have to admit African Americans. Instead of doing that, they passed a second Morrill Act and created historically black colleges, and then chronically underfunded the historically black colleges until today. There are many lawsuits right now winding through the federal courts about this problem. And as a result, we create this two-tiered, separate, and unequal higher education system of historically black colleges and other colleges and that are for whites. And that that division further widens the gap of inequality in terms of wealth and economic opportunity.
And I think you're presenting very well how what we see today really is a consequence of slavery and the legacy of that slavery, be it
Absolutely.
the substandard housing, be it the substandard education. In my field of medicine, traditionally, racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented, and frankly, we've made very little progress since the 1970s in increasing medical school enrollment among Latinos and among African Americans, and
Yes.
all of this can be traced back, and we have an awful long way to go. So I want to talk about reparations briefly. You said there have been some historical tries at reparations. Tell us about those.
Yeah, well, I started talking about a few of them. There were attempts, and none of them have been sufficient enough. I would say Reconstruction is one. Reconstruction, I discussed in the previous episode, was an attempt at reparations, laws that were passed to try to benefit African Americans and help them to adjust to post-slavery. Didn't succeed, and we talked about that because of the compromise that occurred. It was homesteading, another opportunity for reparations. Once again, African Americans were not able to fully benefit from the Homesteading Act. The Southern Homesteading Act that was created only lasts for a short period of time, not enough time for African Americans to benefit from that. The land grant colleges, another opportunity. So we create these historically black colleges as to begin to educate the former slaves. The problem is that those colleges are underfunded and they don't develop and evolve to be the same level of quality education you can get at the other land grant colleges. There's affirmative action, which the Nixon administration tries to use to create more black entrepreneurs, which was his goal there. And I would even say the Affordable Care Act that came out of the Obama administration. Part of the Affordable Care Act expanded eligibility for Medicaid, and the federal government paid virtually 100% of the cost of the expansion. But when you look at the states that refused to expand, they were the states with the largest black populations. So African Americans disproportionately were not able to benefit from the benefits from the Affordable Care Act.
Right, and I'm not sure if we're on the same page. My guess is that we are, but I'm hoping that one day we achieve single payer sooner rather than later, because that will remove all these sort of inequities, get rid of the inefficiencies in our present system, and at least open the door to more equality in healthcare. Now, there are ways in which reparations might be structured, and I think we can just freely associate here. I can imagine, for instance, there's some history to this in post-war Germany, that the German government has spent billions of dollars in so-called reparations, and that could be in return of art to families from which it was stolen. Often that required the courts getting involved, of course, but they've been sort of dragged slowly into this. Some of it is donations to foundations and organizational institutions. Some of it has been direct grants to provide housing or repatriation of Jews to Israel. And they still spend over $100 million each year doing this. In the United States, we have another example of this in the formal apology that was issued by the Clinton administration in 1988 to the Japanese Americans who were interned in camps, for instance, on Angel Island in San Francisco Harbor and at other places in the United States. And I think the amount that they received was something on the order of $88,000 per person. So we've already paid reparations to one group in the United States. How do you imagine the various ways that we could construct reparations, and who should benefit, whom might be qualified or eligible, I should say is a better word, to receive such reparations? And I'll let you freely associate.
You forgot to mention that slave owners also received reparations after the Civil War.
Right, exactly.
Right? So there's clearly a precedent for reparations.
Reparations, right.
Yeah. So, well, you know, the reparations it's a very complicated problem. It is a complicated problem. You now have large numbers, and I think actually a plurality of African Americans whose ancestors were not slaves in this country. You know, and so should they receive reparations? Well, they may have still had been subject to the Jim Crow era, and certainly there's contemporary racism and discrimination that occurs that they're still subject to. But I think that's a decision that's got to be made. Is the reparation for slavery specifically, or is it for the entire 400 years of inequity that you know an inequality that we had in this country?
Sure. Now, I'll stop you for a second. My understanding was that most African Americans today can trace their roots back to Africa. Now, there's been a lot of mixing of the races over time, and so for various individuals there might be a dilution, so to speak, in that. But correct me if I'm wrong.
What I meant by that, for example, my ancestors were not slaves in the United States. My parents immigrated here from the Caribbean, and I'm the first generation of my family born in this country. So personally, but my wife's ancestors were. So what about our children?
And they may have brought your ancestors to the Caribbean as part of the slave trade, but I don't know.
Clearly, my ancestors were in the Caribbean because of the slave trade. There's no question about it. But the point I'm making is that if the U.S. government is paying reparations, should the U.S. government pay reparations to people whose ancestors were enslaved
from the Caribbean?
Exactly. So that becomes the question.
Sure.
Those are the types of things that make this a very, very, very complicated problem. You also look at the fact that you also have a lot of African Americans whose families immigrated to this country in the last 50 years, who came directly from Africa and who never were slaves in Africa or America or the Caribbean, right? And so, but they are African Americans. They are still dealing with inequality in this country.
Correct.
But they were not directly or indirectly affected by slavery because they didn't have that in their family history. So this is a very complicated problem. I do know that there's a bill that's been introduced in the House of Representatives. I think for the last 30 years, it has not yet passed out of the House and nor to the Senate. But that bill is to create a commission that would work on this issue of how would we go about building up reparations. But there are some ideas that make sense, I think. Some of the things you talked about with funds used to create museums that create so that people become aware and knowledgeable about this history. I think we could also look at teaching the history in school. You know, teaching the full history, not simply slavery existed, it was a long time ago and it ended, which is pretty much the way it's taught right now. But to talk about the nuances of what happened and the various things that happened along the way, some of the things that we talked about and we glossed over a lot, even in this conversation.
Sure, we could talk for 12 hours and not scratch the surface even.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, let's start really teaching that history in schools.
Mm-hmm.
How about this for institutions that benefited from slavery, like universities and other large institutions? What about if those universities were to put a portion of their assets in black-owned banks or other community banks that lend to black business owners or lend to black homeowners and help to develop economically disadvantaged, predominantly black communities around the country?
Yeah, especially when you think of the massive endowments that some of these places have.
Yeah, it would be virtually of little effect on these institutions to move portions of their endowment to be controlled by African Americans, who we know in those banks they are more likely to invest in black neighborhoods, and you would still get the same return on those investments. So that would be another approach that we can take. There are things we can do to address reparations, even though we can't identify the specific individuals who were enslaved and provide them with.
And certainly changes in housing policy, and maybe even a branch of the federal government that's devoted to not just studying, but developing programs, the likes of which we mentioned, that directly reports to the president, that finds ways to basically level the playing field for all. I think the fact is the playing field is not level. I'm where I am today as a physician because of where I was born and when I was born and the color of my skin. Some of it's due to my smarts, I'd like to think, but I think I was starting a race, a 100-yard dash at the 40-yard line. And a lot of people were starting, back at the beginning, or if not behind the starting line. There are other groups that might claim that they have a valid claim to reparations also. The Native Americans.
And I would agree with that.
The Latinos, the ones who were brought here from China to build the railroads and lived under horrific conditions. Of course, the Japanese who were interned in World War II. And I think to get broad public support for reparations, and unfortunately public support in most polls now is, if it hits 30%, that's good. To get broad public support, we need to design this in a way that it's inclusive, but that we also don't, for want of a better word, tick off people who might be poor and white and say, well, wait a second, I happen to have been born in Appalachia, and I was starting behind the starting line too, and this is not fair. How can we design a system that will broadly satisfy those constituencies and achieve equity while we make everyone happy and think that it's fair?
The question I would ask is, what are the reparations for? Is it to redress slavery specifically, or is it to address inequity or discrimination in general? If it's to address discrimination in general, then I think, sure, there are definitely other groups of people who have very valid and legitimate claims for reparations as well. Doesn't mean, so the Japanese did get reparations. So because I would never argue that because African Americans didn't get reparations that the Japanese shouldn't have gotten it.
Right.
They should have gotten it, right? Both groups should get it.
Right.
So I'm for everybody getting reparations who deserves to have reparations. I'm not only for African Americans. Native Americans, without a doubt, I mean, they experienced genocide on a scale even that African Americans didn't experience. They experienced having their lands totally stripped from them, and I think Native Americans absolutely deserve reparations of some sort.
Yeah, 99% of their population was wiped out. Now, of course, a lot of that was through disease, but still.
Yeah, but even but disease was weaponized.
Right, exactly.
It's intentional.
Yeah.
Right, so I think I think the fact that Southern California, Arizona, and New Mexico are considered part of the United States rather than Mexico, that, that those were lands that was taken by force from Mexico. I mean, I think there's an argument that Mexican Americans deserve reparations. I think that there's a legitimate argument here that many groups can make that is deserving of reparations.
So I would love to go on about this forever. Unfortunately, we only have a couple minutes left to conclude, so I'm going to give that to you to talk about, and then I know this is a big order, what we're facing today with the current administration and the obstacles you see to achieving racial justice in the United States.
Yeah. I see with this current administration that there are many obstacles. I mean, I think the very concept of the United States as a truly special country is at risk. That we were the country with, peaceful transitions of government. We were the country that at least aspired to be a country of laws and not a country of men, and that where everyone would be held accountable equally. We never actually reached that ideal, but at least that was an aspiration, and we worked towards that. And I think that in the current administration, we're moving away from that. And in many ways, this idea of American exceptionalism, this administration, because of some of the things it's been doing, has made us less exceptional in the sense that we're not the country anymore that you can look at as being virtuous. We now do torture people.
Right.
We now do rip children away from their families and put them in cages. So I think that's what's at stake, and I think that's even bigger than the racial issue.
Right.
It's the entire country, our entire identity of who we are as a people, as Americans, is at stake.
And unfortunately, I think this is going to take us decades to recover from. But we cannot even attempt to claim ethical primacy anymore in the world. And indeed, we're in a state of perpetual war that hopefully won't continue. So I want to remind our viewers, we've had a couple of programs specifically related to the current president. One is entitled Complicit, and the other one is with Dr. Bandy Lee from Yale University, which is entitled Donald Trump is Mentally Unfit to be President. And I think that those programs are as relevant today as they were back then. I want to thank you so much, Dr. LaVeist, for coming on the program today. I know you're very busy. I would like to direct people also to your website, which I've explored some, to your books, your many publications, and the fine work that you've done. And my gratitude for coming on the program. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been a great pleasure. This has been Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. Please join us next time.